Hi, my name is Autif Kamal, and this is another episode of Be Logical. In this episode, I will talk about the idea of a conditional syllogism. I'll explain two types, and then I will apply those concepts to a discussion on GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. Okay. Now, for the first type of conditional syllogism or argument, you have the first premise, which is just a conditional proposition, which is like if X then Y, where X is the cause and Y is the effect. Then you'll have a second premise. In the second premise, you have an affirmation of the cause, and then for the conclusion, you'll have an affirmation of the effect. Okay, so it's saying that whenever this particular cause occurs, this effect that was said to occur in the first premise will occur in the conclusion. Okay. Now, for the second type of conditional syllogism, a valid conditional syllogism, the first premise is the same. You have a conditional proposition, but in the second premise, you have a denial of the effect. And because you have a denial of the effect, the conclusion will be a denial of the cause that would be said to bring about that effect. Okay, so it's saying that because this cause would necessitate this effect, then the negation of the effect means that cause must not have occurred. Okay, now I'm just going to give you an example, not pertaining to GMOs, to illustrate how both types of conditional syllogisms work. Okay, so here's an illustration of the first type of a valid conditional syllogism. So we start with the first premise, which is a conditional proposition. If you bike on broken glass, your tire will pop. And we're going to assume that in every single case that you bike on broken glass, your tire will pop. Okay, we're going to assume that's true. Also, for those of you who are viewing the video, you'll notice that the cause is highlighted in orange, and the effect is highlighted in yellow. Okay, premise 2, you have an affirmation of the cause. You bike on broken glass. So if the effect does necessarily occur every time that cause occurs, then your conclusion will be your tire will pop. Okay, so that's the first type. For the second type, again, you start with the same premise. If you bike on broken glass, your tire will pop. Now in the second premise, you have a negation of the effect. If you biking on broken glass is supposed to necessitate that your tire will pop, then the cause must not have occurred since the effect did not occur. So then the conclusion you get is you do not bike on broken glass. Okay, now we're going to apply this to a discussion on GMOs. So we just finished having an election, and I live in California. One of the propositions that was put up to a vote was Proposition 37, which, if it had passed, it would require that food containing GMOs would be labeled as such. Okay, so here's one conditional syllogism I can give you related to that. If food contains GMOs, it will be labeled as having GMOs. That's the first premise. Now premise 2, this apple is not labeled as having GMOs. Okay, so the conclusion would be this apple does not have GMOs. So basically, in a world where our food was labeled as having GMOs and they were 100% consistent in labeling those foods that do have GMOs, then you would know which food does not have GMOs because they wouldn't have that label on it. Okay, that was the point of me giving you that first conditional syllogism. Okay, and you notice that for the second premise, I negated the effect that, like, this apple is not labeled as having a GMO. I didn't have to say food. I just had to mention some type of food. Okay. Now, going back into a discussion on GMOs. What is a GMO? Well, it's a genetically modified organism, but what is a genetically modified organism? Okay, I'll try to elaborate on that more. A crop which contains a genetically modified organism contains genes that were transferred to it from another organism. I don't know, I can't explain how that process works, but that is a result of the process. And why would they go through that process? They would go through that process to take traits from one organism which would be desirable to put in another organism or a plant or a crop. Okay, and advantages that a crop would get from having certain genes transferred to it would be like resistance to disease, to pests, to drought, to the cold. Okay, so in essence, GMOs would increase its lifespan in that way. Okay, so here's another conditional syllogism for you. And you know, we're going to call those ways of resistance that like cold, drought, pest, disease, all that, we're going to call those collectively natural destructive processes. Okay, now imagine that you're at the grocery store, okay, and you have this first premise as a principle. If this food contains GMOs, it is resistant to natural destructive processes. Premise 2, this apple contains GMOs, so the conclusion is this apple is resistant to natural destructive processes. Okay, so I affirmed the cause, and assuming that that principle is true in the first premise, then that would necessitate the effect of the apple being resistant to natural destructive processes. Okay, now I'm going to go back into a discussion on GMOs. Now, those are some advantages. There is at least one disadvantage to putting GMOs in food. There may be more, but I'm only going to talk about one of them. The one I want to focus on is that over time, pests that were repelled from foods containing GMOs eventually become resistant to GMOs. So that means that they will eventually be able to still feed on food that contains GMOs. So you have another conditional syllogism. Premise 1, if food contains GMOs, some insects will still feed on it. Premise 2, this apple contains GMOs. So what does that mean about the apple? Well, the conclusion is that some insects still fed on it. Okay? So, now, having said that, I want to give you a little bonus argument. It consists of both a disjunctive proposition and a couple conditional propositions. Premise 1, either our crops do not contain GMOs or they do contain GMOs. One of those has to be true. Premise 2, if our crops do not contain GMOs, insects will feed on them. Premise 3, if our crops do contain GMOs, some insects will still feed on them. So the conclusion is that insects will feed on our crops, since one of the causes in premise 2 or premise 3 must be true. Okay, and that concludes this discussion on conditional syllogisms, two valid types of conditional syllogisms, and how they apply to a discussion on GMOs.